Catch up for the newcomers. So far, pigeons have started a world war over a French fry, detonated an entire economy with one loaf of bread, destroyed a bird bath out of sheer politeness, and survived a worm shortage that ended a grown man's love life. 4 episodes, 4 disasters. And through every single one of them, one bird has been quietly getting richer in the background, watching, waiting, taking notes. Gary. Today, Gary wins. Today, Gary buys the whole park. And we find out what happens to a market when one seller owns absolutely everything, a thing economists call a monopoly, and a thing your wallet just calls Tuesday. First, a refresher from last episode, because it's the whole key to today. Remember how the worm price stayed fair? It wasn't because Gary was nice. Gary has never been nice. Gary was born without the gene. The price stayed fair because Gary had competition. If Gary charged too much, the seller right next to him charged a little less and stole every customer Gary had. Competition is a leash. It is the single reason a seller ever gives you a good deal. Not love, not generosity, just the cold terror of the guy next door. Take away that guy, and the leash comes off. And Gary has been staring at that leash, dreaming for 5 episodes. Gary's plan is simple and elegant and deeply evil. He is not going to compete. Competing is exhausting. Gary is going to buy the competition. He starts with the pretzel cart, buys it. Then the hot dog stand, buys it. The worm market, well, he already owns that. Then he buys Greg's worm farm, the one from last episode. Gary writes Greg a check so enormous that Greg retires on the spot to a significantly nicer dumpster. One by one, every single place a pigeon can get a bite to eat in this park sprouts a tiny new sign in the corner. A Gary company. And then, one grim afternoon, it's done. There is no other seller. There is no guy next door. For the first time in park history, if you want to eat, you go to Gary. Every road leads to Gary. Gary isn't in the market anymore. Gary is the market. That's a monopoly. One seller. No competition, no alternatives, no leash. So what does Gary do with absolute unchecked power? Exactly what you would do. Don't lie. He raises the price. A worm was 1 crumb. It's now 8. A pretzel was 2 crumbs. It's now 20. And you pay it. Because what's the alternative? Starve? Gary is betting you won't. Gary is infuriatingly correct. But here's the genuinely sneaky part. The bit that took economists embarrassingly long to figure out. A monopolist doesn't just raise prices. A monopolist sells less stuff on purpose. Watch. Back when there was competition, Gary sold 1,000 worms a day at 1 crumb each. Lots of worms, tiny markup, everybody eats. Now, as a monopoly, Gary runs the numbers and discovers something dark. He makes more money selling 400 worms at 8 crumbs than 1,000 worms at 1. Fewer sales, fatter margin, bigger pile. So Gary deliberately digs up fewer worms. He would rather sell less and charge more. And part of what's happening here is just a transfer. Back under competition, the gap between what a worm was worth to you and the measly crumb you paid for it, that little bit of leftover value, stayed in your pocket. Economists call it your surplus. Under Gary, he reaches into that pocket and takes it. A monopoly is a giant straw, quietly moving value out of 1,000 customers' pockets and into one bird's nest. And honestly, economists don't even lose the most sleep over the straw. Gary's crumbs are still crumbs. They're just in a meaner nest now. What truly haunts them is the next part. Because think about who Gary's high price leaves out. There are hundreds of pigeons who'd gladly buy a worm at 2 crumbs, or 3. Hungry birds, crumbs in their pocket, ready to trade right now. Under competition, every one of them eats, and the seller is thrilled to sell to them. Under Gary, those trades just don't happen. Both sides wanted the deal. Both would have walked away happier. And the deal evaporates because it doesn't fit Gary's profit margin. Economists call that lost stack of would-have-been wonderful trades the deadweight loss, and it is the real crime of monopoly. It's not just that you pay more, and it's not just that the crumbs moved. It's that a pile of perfectly good dinners that should exist simply never get made. A monopoly doesn't just take a bigger slice of the pizza, it shrinks the whole pizza so its slice looks bigger. And there's a victim, because there's always a victim, and it's always Pete. Pete, who finally scraped together a worm budget to win back anyone, discovers a worm now costs 8 crumbs, and his entire life savings buys him exactly 1 worm and a disappointing fraction of a second worm. Pete has now been personally ruined by an inflation crisis, a worm shortage, and a monopoly in consecutive episodes. Pete is no longer a character. Pete is a case study. And because Gary now owns you, he gets greedy in a second, sneakier way. He starts charging different birds different prices for the exact same worm. The rich pigeon in the top hat? Full price, 8 crumbs, paid without blinking. The student pigeon with a coupon? Gary generously knocks it down to 3. Not out of mercy, but because 3 crumbs from a broke bird beats 0. Gary isn't running a sale. Gary's running a scanner, reading precisely how much each customer is willing to pay and charging them exactly that. Economists call it price discrimination, and it's why the bird sitting next to you on the flight paid half what you did for the identical sad pretzel. A monopolist's dream isn't one high price. It's a custom price for every single wallet in the park. Okay, you say, so just open a competing stand. Undercut Gary. Get rich. Adorable, you sweet summer pigeon. Gary thought of that before you finished the sentence, because the second thing every monopolist does, right after raising prices, is build a wall. These walls are called barriers to entry, and Gary's got a whole catalog. He owns every worm farm, so good luck even sourcing a worm. That's control of supply. He signs the park's best diggers to exclusive deals. Dig for me, or don't dig here. And some of Gary's walls, he didn't even have to build. They grow on their own, which is the scary part. Because Gary's so enormous, he digs worms cheaper per worm than any tiny rival ever could. That's economies of scale, and it means a startup is losing the race before the gun even goes off. And every bird already shops at Gary's because every other bird already shops at Gary's. The more customers he has, the more worth it he is, which pulls in more customers, which makes him more worth it. That's a network effect, and it's the quietest, strongest wall of all. Nobody switches to the new cart because nobody's switched to the new cart yet. And when one genuinely brave little startup pigeon dares to open a rival cart anyway, Gary drops his price to 0 in that exact spot, sells worms at a loss day after day until the upstart goes broke, and then jacks the price right back up. That's called predatory pricing, and it is the monopoly equivalent of drowning a man and calling it a swimming lesson. The wall was never about feeding you. The wall is to keep competitors out, because Gary knows the only thing in the universe that can hurt him is another Gary. And here's the twist nobody sees coming. It cuts both ways. Gary isn't just the only seller of worms anymore, he's the only buyer of digging. Every worm digger in the park has exactly one possible customer for their labor, and his name is Gary. So Gary squeezes them too. You don't like the wage? Adorable. Go dig for who, exactly? A single, all-powerful buyer is called a monopsony, and it's the evil mirror of a monopoly. Same trap, flipped. A monopoly gouges the people who buy from it. A monopsony lowballs the people who sell to it. Gary, being thorough, is now both at once. He pays his diggers in lint, charges his customers in gold, and pockets the entire canyon in between. And here's the slow rot of it all. A monopoly doesn't just charge more, it gets worse. Ask yourself why Gary ever bothered making a good worm in the first place. Competition. He had to. The other guy was right there, ready to embarrass him. But now? Why would Gary lift a feather to improve anything? Where are you going to go? So the worms get smaller. The pretzels go stale. The service develops a tip jar that is somehow legally mandatory. Monopoly is a comfy chair, and a comfy chair makes you lazy. The same bird who clawed and schemed for 5 episodes to win the market gets fat and slow the instant he's the only one sitting in it. Innovation rarely dies because somebody kills it. It dies because nobody's chasing you anymore. And this is not a bird problem. It's everywhere you look, the second you learn the shape of it. The one bridge into town that charges whatever toll it likes because what are you going to do, swim? The life-saving medicine with a patent and a price tag with a frankly upsetting number of zeros, because there is no other version of it. The app everybody's on purely because everybody's on it. The company town where the only store, the only landlord, and the only boss all coincidentally share a last name. Every single one of them is a Gary. Every one of them is a market that quietly forgot how to have a guy next door. Now, and this matters because this is exactly where people get it wrong, being big is not the crime. Some sellers get enormous by being genuinely, ruthlessly the best. Best worms, lowest prices, and the whole park flocks to them fair and square. That is not a monopoly problem. That's just winning. The crime is never being the only seller. The crime is using your size to make sure nobody else is ever allowed to try. Big because you're great? Wonderful. Big because you bricked the door shut behind you. That's the Gary special. There's also one honest exception worth a beat. Some things are natural monopolies. Remember the bird bath? It would be insane to build 5 competing bird baths in a row. One is simply more efficient. Same with the pipes that carry water or the single rail a train runs on. In those cases, one provider really is the sensible answer. But now you've built a Gary with no leash by design, so the park has to keep him on a different leash, regulation. Cap his price, watch him like a hawk, and accept that one provider, tightly supervised, beats 5 wasteful providers tripping over each other. So how do you deal with a regular garden variety wall building Gary? 3 ways. 1. You break him up. This is antitrust, trust busting, and it's the job of the government, which in this park is still Timmy. Timmy marches in, sees a Gary company stamped on every stand in the park, and declares the empire too big. He splits it. The pretzel cart becomes its own bird's business. The hot dog stand, somebody else's. The worm market, a third. Mildred, naturally, is appointed to enforce the breakup, and does so with a menace that should genuinely concern us all. And just like that, there are 5 sellers again, all terrified of each other, and like magic, prices fall, the worms get bigger, and the leash snaps back on. You didn't punish Gary for being good, you just restored the contest. 2, and this is the fun one. Sometimes nobody has to bust the monopoly because a better idea does it for free. While Gary's getting fat and lazy charging 8 crumbs a worm, some weirdo in a corner of the park invents a thing Gary never saw coming. Say, a seed so cheap and so filling that overnight nobody needs worms at all. And just like that, Gary's mighty worm empire is worth nothing. He owns the entire market for a thing people simply stopped wanting. Economists call this creative destruction, and it's the reason most of the most terrifying monopolies in history never got broken up by a regulator. They got quietly bored to death by something newer and better. The mightiest empire in the park is one good idea away from being a guy alone on a pile of worms nobody wants. The best trust buster is rarely a man with a law. It's usually a better idea and a hungry nobody. 3 is the simplest of all. Keep the door open. Most of the time you don't need to break Gary up or out-invent him. You just have to stop him from bricking the door shut. Ban the predatory pricing. Kill the exclusive deals. Let one brave little cart open up next to his and actually survive. Because the instant a real competitor exists, Gary magically remembers how to behave. Competition does all the work. You just have to protect it. So that's what the park does. Timmy splits the empire, the walls come down, a couple of upstarts roll in, and Gary, for the first time in 5 episodes, has to actually compete again. He hates it, he loathes it, and he lowers his prices anyway. He makes the worms bigger. He installs a loyalty program that is, miraculously, real this time. And somewhere in the new, cheaper, competitive worm market, Pete finally buys a normal worm at a normal price. He doesn't have a date, he's just hungry. But it's a start, and we take what we can get for Pete. And the park eats well. Not because Gary became a good bird. Gary will never be a good bird. The gene is still missing. But because Gary is, once again, beautifully, productively terrified of the guy next door. So here's the moral, and it's a sneaky big one. The thing that ever protected you from a seller was never the seller's kindness. It was competition. The guy next door, the scrappy upstart, the better idea, the open door. A monopoly is dangerous not because one seller got big, but because the contest stopped. And the moment the contest stops, prices climb, output shrinks, quality rots, the innovation dries up, and a whole pile of dinners that should exist quietly never get made. So don't cheer for your favorite company to crush every rival into dust. Cheer for the race to keep running. Protect the contest, not the players. Watch the skies, guard your worms, and whatever you do, do not sell your stand to Gary. Subscribe.